On the morning of July 10, 1943, a German Panzer commander named Captain Hans Joachim Zollenkopf surveyed the wreckage outside Gela, Sicily, with an expression his crew would later describe as somewhere between amusement and contempt. Scattered across the dry Sicilian plain in front of his position lay 17 American M for Sherman tanks, most of them burning, several with their turrets blown completely off by the direct fire of his Panzer IVS and the supporting 88mm flak guns his battalion had positioned the night before. The Americans had charged in column formation across open ground with an aggression that Zollenkopf privately admired, but with a tactical recklessness that had cost them dearly. His own losses: 2 tanks damaged, none destroyed. He wrote in his company log that evening with the confidence of a man who had been fighting since. Poland in 1939. American armor, he noted, was handled with the enthusiasm of men who had never seen what a German anti-tank gun does to a tank that doesn't use terrain. They were brave. And they were dead. 400 kilometers to the northwest, in a field hospital near Palermo, a German artillery lieutenant named Friedrich Kemper was being treated for shrapnel wounds he had received 2 days earlier. He had not been hit by Allied infantry, or by an aircraft, or by a tank. He had been standing in a perfectly concealed observation post that no Allied ground force could have located from any direction, and the American artillery had found him anyway. The shells had not come in gradually, one battery ranging before others joined. They had arrived all at once, from multiple directions simultaneously, as if the sky itself had calculated exactly where he was standing and decided to close in on that single point. He described the experience to the doctor, treating him with the language of a man trying to explain something genuinely new. It was not like German artillery, he said. It was not like British artillery. It was something else entirely. It was as if someone had done mathematics that no one had told us existed. The distance between these two experiences, Zollenkopf's contempt for American tanks on the plain below, Gela, and Kemper's bewilderment at the artillery that had appeared from nowhere above. Palermo captures one of the most precise and revealing contradictions in all of the Second World War. For a period that stretched from the first American engagements in North Africa in late 1942 through the early months of the Italian campaign in 1943, German soldiers genuinely did laugh at American tanks. The laughter was earned. The Sherman was, by the standards of German armor, a machine with significant and well-documented tactical flaws that experienced Panzer crews exploited with brutal efficiency. But during that same period, in the same battles, on the same ground, those same German soldiers were experiencing something with American artillery that produced no laughter at all. It produced, in the testimonies and letters and after-action reports that German officers left behind, a vocabulary of fear that they used for almost nothing else in the entire war. This is the story of how the same army could be, simultaneously, dangerously overconfident about one American weapons system and genuinely terrified of another, and what the gap between those two reactions reveals about the nature of American military power and why it ultimately proved impossible to defeat. The German contempt for American tanks in the early war period was not a matter of prejudice or wishful thinking. It was a professional assessment grounded in observable evidence that any competent armor officer would have reached from the same data. The M for Sherman, when it appeared in North African combat in late 1942, had characteristics that German tankers immediately categorized, tested, and found wanting in ways that mattered for their survival. The Sherman's armor was adequate against German light anti-tank weapons at medium range, but it was vulnerable to the long-barreled 75mm gun mounted on the Panzer from distances at which German crews could engage comfortably. Against the 88mm gun, whether mounted on the Tiger tank or deployed in its original flak role as a devastating anti-tank weapon, the Sherman's frontal armor offered no meaningful protection at almost any combat distance. But the armor was not the element that German tankers discussed most in their private correspondence and operational after-action reports. The element they discussed most, with a consistency that crossed every theater where Shermans appeared, was the ammunition. The Sherman carried its main gun ammunition in what American engineers had designed as a practical and space-efficient configuration. The rounds were stored in the sponsons along the hull sides, and additional rounds were stacked in racks throughout the fighting compartment. This arrangement maximized the number of rounds immediately available to the crew and simplified the loading process. It was, from the perspective of a production engineer thinking about crew efficiency, a reasonable solution. From the perspective of a German Panzer commander who had just penetrated the Sherman's armor with an armor-piercing round, it was a gift. When a Sherman was penetrated, the exposed ammunition frequently ignited. The resulting internal explosion was catastrophically violent, more violent than the penetration of a comparable German tank hit with the same round, because the ammunition fire triggered a chain reaction through the entire fighting compartment. American crews began calling their tank the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter brand whose advertising slogan was light's first time, every time. The nickname was dark humor in the tradition of men who have to find a way to live with a dangerous fact. The German tankers, who observed the phenomenon from the outside, had no need for dark humor about it. They simply noted it in their operational assessments and adjusted their targeting priorities accordingly. Lieutenant General Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded the finest armored formations in the German military, was interrogated after the war about his assessment of the Sherman. His answer was characteristically direct. As a tank designed for one-on-one combat against German armor, he said, the Sherman was inferior to virtually every German medium and heavy tank we fielded after 1942. We knew this. Our crews knew this. In tank versus tank engagements, where terrain and positioning were roughly equal, German armor won consistently in the early and middle periods of the war. This was not a secret. The Sherman's other widely documented weakness was its silhouette. The tank was tall, significantly taller than German Panzer IVS and Panthers, because of the design of its hull and turret. This height made it more visible than German tanks in hull-down defensive positions, and it meant that a Sherman attempting to find cover behind a ridge or terrain feature would expose more of its profile to enemy fire than an equivalent German tank in the same position. German anti-tank crews, who understood the geometry of hull-down shooting as well as any soldiers in the world, exploited this height differential consistently and lethally. In Italy, where the terrain of mountains and narrow valleys created conditions ideally suited to defensive anti-tank warfare, the combination of the Sherman's armor vulnerability, its ammunition configuration, and its height made it a target that experienced German crews could engage with a confidence that bordered, in the testimony of some captured officers, on something approaching sport. Major Hans von Luck-Componentry wrote in his memoir about the tactical pattern that his unit had developed for engaging American armor in the Italian theater. We would allow the Shermans to advance until they were committed to a specific avenue of approach, he wrote. Then the 88s would open from flanking positions that the Shermans could not cover simultaneously. The ammunition fires were visible for miles. After several engagements of this type, American tank commanders became more cautious, which was the correct response. But their caution could not compensate for the fundamental characteristics of the vehicle they were operating. This was the foundation of the German contempt. It was not contempt for American bravery. Every German officer who wrote about American armor acknowledged that the crews fought with courage that commanded professional respect. It was contempt, precise and earned, for a machine that German technical analysis had correctly identified as tactically inferior in the scenarios, where German doctrine was designed to create maximum disadvantage for attacking armor. What those same German officers were experiencing with American artillery during the same period was so different in nature that the two assessments seem to belong to entirely separate conflicts. The American artillery fire direction system was, by 1943, the most sophisticated integrated fire control apparatus in the world. This was not an accident of wartime improvisation. It was the product of 20 years of quiet, systematic development at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. During the interwar period, when most military establishments were focused on cutting budgets and most nations were trying to forget what artillery had done on the Western Front of the previous war. The core innovation was the Fire Direction Center, a concept that sounds bureaucratic but was, in practical terms, a revolution in the application of firepower that no other army in the world had fully replicated by the time it was first used in combat. The principle was centralization. Instead of individual batteries communicating directly with their own forward observers and operating as essentially independent fire units, all fire requests from all observers in a sector were routed through a single fire direction center at the battalion level. This center had the computational tools, the trained personnel, and the communications infrastructure to coordinate the fires of multiple batteries against a single target with a speed that German artillerists found, in the most literal sense of the word, incomprehensible. The practical consequences were visible in the first engagements, where the system was used at scale. A German battery commander, an infantry officer calling for support, or an armored unit moving across open ground that thought it was outside artillery range, any of these could find, within 3 minutes of being observed by a single American forward observer, the concentrated fire of not one battery, but potentially dozens of guns from multiple battalions, converging on their positions simultaneously. The time from observation to first round impact in the German system was typically 10 to 12 minutes, and that 10 to 12 minutes assumed that a single battery was firing. Concentrating fires from multiple units in the German system required communications up the chain and back down that could extend the time considerably further. 3 minutes versus 12 minutes is a difference that sounds, stated abstractly, like an administrative efficiency. On the battlefield, it was the difference between reaching cover and being caught in the open, between getting the wounded into the aid station and watching them die before the first shell landed, between repositioning before the barrage began and being destroyed in position before the order to move could be given. Sergeant Major Werner Körner, a veteran of the Eastern Front who was transferred to Italy in 1943 and was interrogated by American intelligence after his capture near Monte Cassino in 1944, described the first time his unit was caught in coordinated American artillery fire with a precision of detail that suggested the experience had etched itself permanently into his memory. We had moved into a position that our reconnaissance had assessed as safe, he said. We were concealed. The position had not been used before. There were no obvious registration points nearby that would give us away. Within 4 minutes of our arrival, for minutis the first shells fell, not ranging shots, not a single battery finding the range. The full concentration from at least 3 directions simultaneously. I had been under Soviet artillery since 1941. I had been under German artillery during exercises. I had never experienced anything like this. It felt calculated. It felt personal. It felt as if someone who knew exactly where I was had simply decided, mathematically, to remove me from the battlefield. The sensation Körner was describing, the sense of mathematical inevitability, was, in a strictly technical sense, accurate. The American system was designed to produce exactly this effect. The Fire Direction Center used graphic firing tables, plotting boards, and standardized computational procedures that reduce the time from observation to fire, request to data entry to gun elevation, to trigger pull to a sequence that American crews had practiced until it was almost reflexive. The Germans had no direct equivalent because German artillery doctrine, for all its sophistication in other respects, had never fully developed the concept of centralized multi-battery fire, controlled to the degree that American doctrine had. The weapon that most crystallized the German fear of American artillery, the weapon that appears in more prisoner interrogations, more captured letters, and more after-action German reports than any other single munition of the Western European campaign, was not a gun at all. It was a fuse. The proximity fuse, which the Americans called the VT fuse, and which they had invested over $1 billion developing and producing, was in operational terms a miniaturized radar set small enough to fit inside a standard artillery shell. As the shell descended toward its target, the fuse detected the ground and triggered detonation at an optimal height, typically around 30 feet above the surface, that maximized the lethal fragmentation area against troops in the open or in foxholes. Before the proximity fuse, the effective radius of a standard artillery shell against dug-in infantry was a matter of a few yards. A soldier in a properly constructed foxhole, even one within the nominal bursting radius of an incoming shell, had a reasonable chance of survival if the round landed in soft ground, where the explosion directed most of its energy downward. The foxhole and the slit trench were the fundamental protective structures of infantry warfare precisely because they worked, not perfectly, but well enough that experienced soldiers knew their odds in an artillery barrage improved dramatically if they had time to dig. The proximity fuse eliminated this calculus. A shell detonating 30 feet above a position did not direct its energy into the ground. It directed shrapnel downward and outward across a much wider area, striking personnel in foxholes that would have been safe from a ground burst, reaching soldiers who had taken cover behind walls or embankments, finding men who had correctly assessed the incoming round's trajectory and moved to what their experience told them was a protected position. The first large-scale use of proximity fuses in ground combat came during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. The timing was not accidental. The Allies had been so protective of the secret that they had declined to use the fuse in Western Europe for months, fearing that unexploded rounds landing in German-controlled territory would allow German engineers to reverse-engineer the technology. It was only when the desperate situation of the Bulge and the decision to use every available advantage against the German offensive overrode the secrecy considerations that the fuse was released for ground combat in the European theater. The results were immediate and documented with unusual precision because the scale of the Bulge engagement produced an unusually large number of prisoner interrogations in a short period. German soldiers captured during and immediately after the Bulge engagement were asked systematically about American weapons that had affected their willingness or ability to continue fighting. The proximity fuse received more mentions in these interrogations, with more consistent emotional weight than any other single weapon system. Private First Class Heinz Strobel, captured near Bastogne on December 23, 1944, described his experience of proximity fuse artillery in testimony that his American interrogators preserved in full because of its unusual specificity. "We had been in our positions for 6 hours," he said. "The positions were well dug. We had overhead cover on most of them. Twice before we had been under American artillery, and both times the positions held adequately. Men were wounded, but the unit remained functional. Then something changed. The shells began exploding above us, not on the ground. There was no warning that was different from normal incoming. The sound was the same until it wasn't. Then men who were completely covered, men who were in positions that had survived to previous barrages, were being hit by fragments coming from above. 3 men in my squad died in that barrage," They were in their positions. They did everything correctly. There was nothing to do differently. There was simply nowhere to hide. Strobel's final sentence, "There was simply nowhere to hide," appears in German prisoner testimony about American artillery with a frequency that suggests it captured something genuinely new about the experience. The fundamental premise of infantry defensive warfare was that terrain and construction could provide protection from indirect fire. The proximity fuse challenged this premise at a structural level that experienced soldiers found not merely frightening but philosophically disorienting. General George Patton, who had watched American artillery develop from its pre-war infancy to its wartime maturity with the attention of a man who understood what firepower meant for the offensive operations he specialized in, wrote to the War Department about the proximity fuse with undisguised satisfaction. "The new shell with the funny fuse is devastating," he reported in December 1944. "We caught a German battalion which was trying to get across the Sauer River with a battalion concentration and killed by actual count 702. I think that when all armies get this shell, we will have to devise some new tactics, because one cannot hide from it." Patton's observation that one cannot hide from it was the same observation that German soldiers in their foxholes were making simultaneously from the receiving end. The convergence of these two perspectives, one clinical and satisfied, the other terrified and bewildered, describes more precisely than any single document the nature of what American artillery had become. By the winter of 1944, the most revealing aspect of this contradiction, Sherman contempt alongside artillery terror, is not what it says about the individual weapon systems involved. It is what it says about the American military's understanding of how those systems were supposed to work together. American military doctrine had never been built around the premise that the Sherman would defeat German tanks in one-on-one engagements. This is a point that is frequently missed in post-war analyses that compare Sherman and Tiger specifications as if they were designed for the same purpose. The Sherman was not designed to defeat German tanks by itself. It was designed to be a component of a combined arms system in which artillery, air support, infantry, and armor each performed specific functions. And the success of the whole did not depend on any single component being individually superior to its German counterpart. The implications of this doctrinal difference were profound. German armor doctrine, particularly as it had developed through Guderian's theories and the early war experience of the Blitzkrieg campaigns, placed enormous emphasis on the individual capability of the tank as a weapon system. The Tiger and the Panther were designed to win tank-on-tank engagements decisively and independently, to be so superior in individual combat that they could break through positions that would stop any other vehicle. This approach produced magnificent machines. It also produced machines that required massive investment of specialized manufacturing resources, were difficult to maintain in the field, and were available in numbers that could never compensate through individual excellence for the systemic advantages that American combined arms could generate. The American approach accepted that the Sherman would sometimes lose individual tank engagements. It compensated by ensuring that the Sherman was almost never fighting alone. The artillery that German soldiers feared was not a separate weapon system operating independently from the tanks they laughed at. It was part of the same integrated apparatus that made those tanks effective despite their individual limitations. When American armor attacked, the sequence was artillery preparation, armor advance with infantry support, immediate artillery response to any German anti-tank position that revealed itself by firing, air support for targets beyond artillery range, and logistics that could replace destroyed Shermans faster than German factories could replace Tigers. Colonel Günther Pape, who commanded a Panzer unit during the Normandy campaign and was captured in the Falaise pocket in August 1944, described the evolution of his tactical thinking about American armor in testimony that is preserved at the German Military Archive at Freiburg. In the beginning, he said, we thought that American armor was simply not competent, that it would be easy to engage and destroy. This was correct for individual engagements early in the campaign. What we did not understand, at first, was that American armor did not need to win individual engagements. Every time we revealed a position by destroying a Sherman, artillery fell on that position within minutes. The aircraft came. The infantry worked around. The Shermans kept coming because there were always more Shermans. We were winning the individual fights and losing the battle. Pape's testimony captures, with unusual precision, the mechanism by which American combined arms doctrine converted the Sherman's individual weaknesses into a systemic irrelevance. The German Panzer crew that destroyed a Sherman in a one-on-one engagement had won a tactical victory. The American artillery observer, who had watched that engagement and called in the fire that landed on the German tank position 30 seconds, later had won a different kind of victory, one that didn't appear on the kill ratio charts, but that shaped the operational outcome of the campaign. The ammunition production numbers that underpin the American artillery system are almost impossible to contextualize against German equivalents, because the scale difference is so extreme that normal comparative language fails. Battery C of the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion fired its 100,000th round in November 1944. Having been in sustained combat for less than 6 months since D-Day, the entire German ammunition supply for a corps-level operation on the Western Front in late 1944 was frequently less than what a single American division consumed in a week of sustained offensive operations. German batteries, forced by logistical reality to conserve shells that could not be replaced, developed a tactical culture of careful, selective fire, maximum effect from minimum expenditure, because expenditure could not be made up. American batteries, supplied by an industrial system that produced ammunition in quantities the German logistical imagination could not process, developed a tactical culture of overwhelming abundance, use everything available because there is always more coming. This difference in logistical culture translated directly into tactical behavior that German observers noticed and documented. German artillery answered American fire requests with measured, professional responses calibrated to the importance of the target and the ammunition available. American artillery answered German artillery with concentration of fires that seemed, to soldiers accustomed to the German scale of fire, disproportionate to any plausible military calculation. Prisoners captured in 1944 and 1945 consistently described a sense that American artillery did not make rational decisions about when to fire. It simply fired. The irrationality was, of course, apparent rather than real. American artillery made extremely rational decisions about when and how to fire. But those decisions were made within a logistical framework so different from the German framework that the resulting behavior appeared, from the German perspective, to lack the careful calculation that artillery was supposed to involve. Lieutenant General Fritz Kremer, chief of the Bulge, was interrogated after the war about the factors that had prevented the German offensive from achieving its objectives. His list was long and included fuel shortages, Allied air superiority, the unexpected resistance of American infantry at key road junctions, and the speed of Patton's relief of Bastogne. But when asked to identify the single factor that most consistently limited German freedom of action throughout the offensive, his answer was immediate. American artillery, he said. Always American artillery. We could plan around the tanks. We could find gaps in the air coverage. We could identify the infantry units that would hold and avoid them. But there was no planning around the artillery. It was everywhere. It responded to everything. and it never ran out of ammunition. We were fighting men who had decided that shells cost less than lives, and they had enough shells to prove it. Krugmer's formulation, "shells cost less than lives," was both an economic observation and a cultural one. American military doctrine had made a deliberate choice to spend industrial production rather than human lives wherever that substitution was possible. This choice was not simply humanitarian sentimentality. It was a strategic calculation rooted in political reality. A democratic nation fighting a long war needed to maintain public support. Public support was more sustainable when casualties were controlled and the material costs of the war, however enormous, were borne by factories rather than families. The artillery system was, in this sense, not merely a tactical tool. It was a political instrument that made sustained public commitment to the war psychologically manageable. German soldiers, who found themselves on the receiving end of this instrument, did not know, and would not have cared, about the political theory behind it. They knew only that the artillery came, that it came fast, and that it kept coming regardless of how many positions they changed or how carefully they concealed themselves. The fear this created was not the ordinary fear of combat, which soldiers train to manage and which experience eventually contains within functional limits. It was a more corrosive fear, the fear of a system that could not be outwitted, evaded, or exhausted. The final irony of the Sherman contempt is that, by the winter of 1944, even the tanks had changed in ways that the German assessments of 1942 and early 1943 had not anticipated. The Americans had recognized the Sherman's limitations. They had recognized them earlier and more clearly than their post-war critics typically acknowledge, because the American military had a structural capacity for self-assessment that was, like the artillery system, a product of deliberate institutional design rather than accidental discovery. The after-action reporting system, the combat analysis centers, the willingness to relieve commanders who failed and promote those who succeeded. Regardless of seniority, all of these reflected an organizational culture that treated the gap between performance and expectation as information to be processed, rather than embarrassment to be suppressed. The result was a series of progressive modifications to the Sherman and to the doctrine governing its use that incrementally closed the performance gap between American and German armor. The 76mm gun variant, introduced in mid-1944, gave the Sherman the ability to penetrate the frontal armor of Panthers at medium combat distances. The wet ammunition stowage system, developed specifically in response to the catastrophic fires that had given the tank its Ronson reputation, relocated the ammunition into water-jacketed containers that dramatically reduced the frequency and severity of ammunition fires when the tank was hit. The application of improvised armor, sandbags, spare track links, concrete in some instances, by American crews themselves, an innovation that spread laterally through units without waiting for official authorization, partially compensated for the hull armor's limitations in close-range engagements. None of these modifications made the Sherman equal to the Tiger or the late Panther in individual combat. But by the time the Battle of the Bulge began in December 1944, the tank that German tankers had laughed at in Sicily in 1943 was a meaningfully different machine operated by meaningfully more experienced crews using meaningfully more sophisticated combined arms tactics. The laughter, by that point, had largely stopped, not because the Sherman had become what the Tiger was, but because the context in which the Sherman operated had matured into something that individual tank performance comparisons could not capture. General Hasso von Manteuffel commanded the 5th Panzer Army during the Bulge, described the change in his evaluation of American armor between 1943 and 1944 in terms that his post-war interrogators found notably candid. In Italy, we were confident when we knew we faced Shermans He said, "In the Ardennes, we were not." Not because the Sherman had become a better tank than the Panther. It had not. But because by December 1944, fighting American Shermans meant fighting American artillery and American air power and American infantry and American logistics simultaneously, and the Sherman was simply the most visible component of a system that had become genuinely formidable in its totality. We had learned, slowly and at great cost, that the question was never whether the Sherman was a good tank. The question was whether we could survive everything that came with it. Von Manteuffel's final sentence, "whether we could survive everything that came with it," is perhaps the most precise articulation available of what the American combined arms system had achieved by the war's final year. The Sherman alone had never been the point. The artillery alone had never been the point. The logistics alone, the air support alone, the infantry alone, none of these individually was the factor that made American forces, by 1944, effectively impossible to defeat in sustained operations. The factor was the combination, the integration, the system that treated each component not as a weapon to be assessed in isolation, but as a multiplier of every other component in the apparatus. German soldiers who laughed at American tanks in 1942 and feared American artillery in the same battles were, without knowing it, describing the same thing from two different angles. They were describing a military that had made a decision, embedded in doctrine and reflected in the design of every weapon system it produced, that no single component needed to win by itself. What mattered was whether the whole could produce outcomes that no part could produce alone. By 1944, it could. And by 1945, the men who had once laughed at the Ronson lighter that American crews drove into battle understood. In the silence of their prisoner of war camps and the ruins of their cities, that the laughter had been the most expensive mistake they ever made. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. Your support helps us continue sharing important stories from the Second World War that deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to join our community of history enthusiasts from around the world. We would love to hear from you in the comments, whether you have family connections to this history or simply appreciate learning about the past. Thank you for watching, and thank you for helping keep these stories alive for future generations.